Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. Omen from Black Eyes. Mark and Lisa, whose real names were Robert and Michelle, moved to a quiet countryside home on the outskirts of Salem, Oregon, in the middle of winter of 2020. The house was nestled among a large garden with ancient oak trees, creating a serene setting. However, it wasn't long before they started noticing a large, black crow that frequented their backyard. Initially, they just thought it was a normal wild bird, perhaps looking for food, but gradually, the crow's behavior began to become strange. It seemed to watch them intently, even following them with its gaze as they moved around inside their house. They started finding strange objects left on their porch or near their windows, small bones, shiny trinkets, dead insects arranged in odd patterns. Mark felt a bit unnerved, while Lisa was more curious to learn more. To monitor the crow's activities, they decided to install a few security cameras in their backyard. The video footage they reviewed later left them both astonished and worried. The camera recorded the crow frequently pecking at their windows at specific times of the day, as if trying to get their attention. It also made unusual vocalizations that didn't sound like typical crow calls, but more like whispers or disjointed syllables. Mark grew increasingly uneasy about the crow's persistent presence and strange actions, while Lisa, although curious, also felt a growing sense of unease. The crow's behavior began to become more intrusive. They would often find it perched on their car, staring at them as they drove off to work, or even trying to fly into their house through an open window. The strangeness escalated to a chilling point one morning, when Mark went outside to get the newspaper. He was horrified to discover a small dead sparrow lying right on their doorstep. What was even more disturbing was that the sparrow appeared to have been meticulously dissected, and its internal organs were arranged in a bizarre circular pattern. The security camera had captured the entire scene. It showed the crow bringing the sparrow and performing the gruesome act. Mark was completely convinced that this crow was more than just a bird, that some dark force was at play. Lisa was also deeply worried and scared. They tried various methods to deter the crow, but it persisted in its strange behavior. Seemingly undeterred by their attempts to scare it away, they researched local folklore and superstitions related to crows and discovered unsettling stories about them being messengers of death or harbingers of bad luck. The crow's behavior became more aggressive. It started cawing loudly and incessantly outside their windows at night, preventing them from sleeping, or even dive-bombing them when they were in their yard. One afternoon, while Lisa was gardening, the crow swooped down and pecked her hand sharply, drawing blood. The story reached its terrifying climax one stormy night. Mark and Lisa were trying to sleep when they heard violent pecking at their bedroom window. They turned on the light and were horrified to see the crow relentlessly pecking at the glass, its black eyes staring intently at them in a menacing way. Suddenly, the crow picked up something in its beak and dropped it onto the windowsill. It was a human tooth. Both Mark and Lisa felt a surge of absolute terror. They no longer doubted it. This crow was not just an ordinary animal, but it was bringing a terrible omen to their doorstep. They knew they had to do something to stop it before it was too late. Story 2. Intruder in the Stormy Night. Sarah and Ben, whose real names were Emily and Thomas, were a young married couple living in an isolated farmhouse in rural Indiana in the late fall of 2022. One night, a severe thunderstorm hit their area, with heavy rain, strong winds, and constant lightning tearing across the sky. They were sitting in their living room, trying to relax to the sound of the downpour outside, when suddenly they heard a loud thud against a window, followed by frantic flapping inside the room. They were horrified to see a large, black crow had somehow gotten inside. Initially, they tried to guide the frightened bird back outside, but it behaved erratically, flying around the living room, crashing into walls and furniture. They noticed the crow seemed particularly fixated on an old, boarded-up fireplace in the living room. It constantly flew towards it and pecked violently at the wooden planks. Ben decided to set up a security camera in the living room to monitor the situation while they tried to get some rest in the bedroom. The video footage they reviewed later revealed increasingly strange behavior from the crow. It would often land on the mantelpiece and stare intently at the boarded-up fireplace, making soft, guttural sounds, and even seeming to try to pry the boards open with its beak and claws. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease, remembering old superstitions about birds entering the house being bad omens, especially during storms. Ben tried to remain rational but was also starting to feel creeped out. Throughout the night, they periodically checked the live camera feed and witnessed more unsettling behavior. The crow hopped around the living room with an unnatural gait, picking up small objects and dropping them in front of the fireplace, and even appearing to listen to something they couldn't hear. At one point, they saw the crow fly directly at the camera and then suddenly drop to the floor as if it had been struck by something invisible. Sarah became convinced that something paranormal was happening and that the crow was reacting to it, possibly drawn into their house by the storm or by something already present within. Ben researched the history of their farmhouse and discovered that a tragic fire had occurred many years ago, and someone might have died near the fireplace. He began to suspect a connection between the crow and the house's dark past. The crow's behavior became more frantic and desperate. It started pecking and scratching at the boarded-up fireplace with increasing intensity, as if trying to break through. Suddenly, the boards around the fireplace began to rattle violently on their own. Even though the crow was no longer touching them, a cold draft filled the living room. Sarah and Ben held each other tightly, a profound sense of fear washing over them. The climax occurred around 3 a.m. The crow's frantic pecking and scratching abruptly stopped. Instead, they heard a raspy whisper coming from behind the boarded-up fireplace. The voice sounded ancient and full of suffering. "Let me out! Let me out!" Sarah and Ben exchanged horrified glances. They knew the crow wasn't the source of these strange occurrences, but rather a sign, a messenger for an evil presence trapped within the fireplace walls. Unable to bear it any longer, Ben decided he had to do something. He grabbed a sledgehammer from the garage and returned to the living room. Sarah tried to stop him, but Ben was determined to tear down the boards sealing the fireplace. As the last plank was ripped away, a blast of icy air and a putrid stench filled the room. In the darkness of the fireplace, they saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at them. The crow perched on the mantelpiece, letting out a satisfied caw. Immediately after, a shadowy figure began to emerge from within the fireplace. It took the form of a gaunt man with a twisted and angry face. The figure slowly moved towards Sarah and Ben, and the crow circled above their heads, cawing menacingly. Sarah screamed in terror, and Ben swung the sledgehammer at the shadowy figure, but the hammer seemed to pass right through it without any effect. The figure continued to advance, and Sarah and Ben knew they were facing something beyond their comprehension. something evil and incredibly dangerous. Their fate now rested entirely in the hands of the shadowy figure and the spooky crow. Story 3. Shadow at 313. Emily and John, whose real names were Margaret and Walter, were a retired couple living in a quiet neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, in the late summer of 2023. Their life was peaceful until they started noticing a large, black crow that appeared in their backyard every afternoon around 3 p.m. Initially, they just thought it was a normal wild bird, perhaps looking for shade or some leftover food. But gradually, the crow's behavior began to become strange. It would always perch on the same branch of the large maple tree in their yard and stare intently at their kitchen window for extended periods. After the crow flew away, they would often find small, peculiar objects placed on their patio, shiny buttons, smooth pebbles arranged in lines, small, dried wildflowers. John, a retired engineer, was intrigued and decided to install a few security cameras in the backyard to monitor the crow's daily routine. The video footage they reviewed later revealed increasingly bizarre behavior. The crow would peck at the glass of their kitchen window precisely at 3:13 p.m. every afternoon, making a specific clicking sound with its beak, and sometimes even appearing to mimic human speech in soft, garbled sounds. Emily grew increasingly uneasy about the crow's daily ritual, especially the precise timing and the strange objects it left behind. John, although trying to find a logical explanation, was also becoming increasingly disturbed. The crow's behavior started to become more targeted. They noticed it seemed particularly interested in their cat, Whiskers, who often sat on the windowsill. The crow would sometimes tap on the glass when Whiskers was nearby, seemingly trying to interact with it. The strangeness escalated when one afternoon, they saw the crow pecking at an old doll that Emily had left on the porch table. The crow pecked at the doll's eyes with deliberate intent, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. Another afternoon, they were horrified to discover a dead bird, a species they had never seen before, placed right on their welcome mat. The security camera showed the crow bringing the bird and placing it there. Emily was completely convinced that this crow was not just a normal bird, but that some supernatural force was controlling it, possibly related to a former resident of their house or a local legend. John, who had always believed in science, also began to feel his explanations falling short. They tried various methods to deter the crow, but it continued its daily visits, seemingly unfazed by their efforts. They researched local folklore and historical events related to crows in their area and discovered unsettling connections to omens or lingering spirits. The crow's behavior became more ominous. It started cawing loudly and incessantly outside their bedroom window every afternoon before it left. And sometimes they heard scratching sounds on their roof right after the crow flew away. One afternoon, precisely at 3:13 p.m., while Emily was watering plants in the garden, the crow suddenly swooped down and pecked her wrist sharply, drawing blood. The story reached its terrifying climax one afternoon. Right at 3:13 p.m., the crow arrived and perched on its familiar maple tree branch. Instead of looking at the kitchen window, it turned its head towards the front door of the house and began to caw mournfully, as if in distress. Then, it flew down and landed on the porch step, dropping something. It was John's house key, the one he always kept carefully in his pants pocket. Both Emily and John felt a surge of absolute terror. They knew this crow was not just an ordinary bird, but it was trying to warn them about something terrible about to happen. Just as they were about to approach the door, It suddenly burst open violently. And a tall, dark figure stood in the doorway, its red eyes glowing menacingly as it stared directly at them. The crow let out one final, piercing caw and then flew straight up into the sky, leaving Emily and John to face the terrifying shadow in their own home. If you want to hear more true horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.